Mind in our language is a noun, and nouns we associate with things, do we not? But is mind a thing? Well, I shall argue that it is not, and that our language is very misleading in the sense that it suggests to us, by the very use of the word mind, that it is a thing which in some way we could apprehend, grasp, understand, any of these sorts of things. Whereas what I shall suggest is that mind is a process. And in the sense that it's a process, you cannot grasp it. A river is a process. Can you grasp a river? Plainly not. There's a nice little Zen dialogue which I remember coming across some time ago, where the pupil comes to the master and says, "Master, try as I might, I cannot still my mind." And the master says to him, "Well, bring me your mind and I will still it." And the student significantly says, "When I look for it, I cannot find it." And at which point the master then aptly says, "Well, there you are, I've stilled it for you, haven't I?" But it's that crucial phrase, "when I look for it, I cannot find it," which is, I think, the essence of this whole problem. If I ask you to look for your mind, you cannot find it. You can find mental process, you can find thoughts, you can find memories, you can find faculties, but when you try and find a thing, which we call the mind, it slips through your fingers. It's not there any longer. It's one of these, it's a non-problem really, because it's only our language which even makes us think that there might be a thing that we could in some way discover. But I'd like you to think then in terms of mind as process. I think it's the key thing. Take another simple analogy, which again our language ties us up with. Take something as simple as seeing and sight. We have the verb to see, and hence seeing, but we also use the noun sight. You don't expect to find an object, do you? Sight. Your experience is in seeing, however we go about it, and seeing is process. It is continuously changing, isn't it? You don't see the same thing 2 seconds running. It's only in fact where things change that you can see at all, as biologists have in fact discovered. It's only where there's change in the visual field that consciousness of the objects of sight wells up at all. You can't, it's not a thing, it's a process. And it's only where it's happening in time, which is what a process in fact entails, that we can grasp it and understand it at all. So, mind, as soon as we start to look at it, we have to see in terms of process. So we shall be much more concerned with faculty rather than trying to identify a single thing which we can otherwise call mind. Now I'd like to look at a series of areas with which the mind is concerned and try and, from a theosophical point of view, deepen your understanding, if you will, of what is involved here. First, what I'd like to do is to look at what sphere or in what area does the mind operate. Now, before we come across theosophical or other occult views concerning the mind, mind seems to us to be something subjective, which happens somewhere in here, though where in here is, we're not quite too sure, and we contrast that with the out there of the so-called objective world with which we normally deal. But when we start examining this process from a theosophical point of view, we see that the in here turns out to be probably more important, more significant, despite the fact that it seems subjective, mere fancy, mere this, that and the other. In fact, from a theosophical point of view, it rapidly turns out to be the more important component compared with the external world. Why? Well, we have a model in the theosophical worldview which says that the cosmos, the universe, has been formed, hesitate to use the word created, but formed, from a relatively subjective condition into a relatively objective condition that we now see. what we see in terms of the physical world, if you will, is the last stage in a process which started with what is to us relatively subjective and has moved through a series of stages of becoming more and more objective, tangible, real, sensible to our five senses. We start with, if what you might call the divine, the spiritual, which is very close to the origin, the one from which the universe has emerged, and moving through a series of evolutionary stages in which the one gradually becomes the many, so we move outwardly to the world that we experience. Now, the process is an intelligent process and happens according to idea, plan, if you will. And the world that we see is the ultimate expression of what you might call the universal mind, the ideas which have formed, patterned, given structure to the world that we actually experience. So the reality of those inner worlds is of paramount importance. Now, what we would say is that the mind that we experience, or the faculties that we use, that we call mind, belong more to those inner worlds than to the outer worlds with which we deal in terms of our five senses and our bodies. What we would then go on to say is that because those are nearer the source, nearer the one from which all has emerged, they are more real than the seemingly tangible world that we call the physical world. It turns, if you will, common sense on its head, where we think normally in terms of common sense of, this is real, I know this is real, this chair that I'm sitting on is definitely real, and my subjective little thoughts which seem to flit about in my mind from time to time, well, they can't be as real as this, can they? Well, the theosophical model turns that completely on its head and says, well, in fact, what goes on in terms of thinking and thought processes is much more real than the material world which we experience through our senses. Despite its tangibility, the consensus reality that it creates for us and so forth, we would say that causatively, in terms of how the world was produced, the inner, which is of the nature of mind, is more real, more substantial than that which we experience as the external world.